happens again.
Mm, yeah. And just whilst you were talking, you reminded me, like, there's this huge affinity amongst, I think, almost everyone you spoke to with
Yeah.
the land,
Mm,
with literally the, like, without, and I don't mean this in a derogatory sense, but literally with the dirt, like with
yeah.
with literally the floor of wherever
Yeah.
they come from. And there wasn't really, as you mentioned correctly, there were obviously some kind of people from the Muslim League who wanted a separate nation, and all the other things along religious lines. But the affinity from the majority of them is to the, literally to the ground. Like, I just felt like it's an interesting concept
It
to
is
me.
interesting. It is interesting.
So what is the understanding of these people to be that
Yeah.
kind of in love literally with, and I know it also goes back to some of the language, so like within Punjabi you say it's the dirty, it's like you wouldn't refer to it as dirt, it's almost like it's respected in a
Mm,
way.
mm,
But like, what is the, like, what's the understanding behind that? Because that's something that props up quite often, and I was like,
mm.
this is fascinating.
Well, no, and that's something that I hadn't realized until I did all these interviews. I the things I expected to hear stories of trauma. I didn't expect to hear as many stories of compassion and kindness and friendship and love as I did. But I didn't expect this kind of attachment to the place that you've left. And even if you chose to leave, even if you thought it was right to leave, and it sometimes it's quite contradictory, you still have that attachment to the land. And as you say, it's something that for the people that do go back, they want to take something, whether it's the earth or the dust or a stone or a brick. And I think that the way that I understand it, or that I've tried to understand it, is that it's evidence that you lived there once, because otherwise there is nothing to prove that you and your family who'd lived there for so many years or generations or decades or however long you lived there, and that's all you have, because there is nothing else. You may not even have carried anything when you left. And so that's what it is. It's saying I was there too, and that was my home, and I still feel something for it. And honestly, I can say that that feeling is felt, what carries on through the generations. You can feel that the trauma, but you also feel, and it's, again, it's what I mean, it's a contradictory thing. The legacy of that generation is also that attachment to the place that's gone as well. And that's what I'm saying about the diaspora, because they're used to feeling many things. I can say I feel an attachment to Lahore. I have never been to Lahore. I don't even know, what it's like, but I feel like that's, Lahore is part of me. That's where my dad grew up. Um, but I'm also, and my dad was Indian, and India is part of me, but so is Britain. And that's the thing, is you can feel all these things, and that has carried on as well, which I think is quite a beautiful thing,
Yeah.
actually.
No, no, definitely. The other kind of benefit of your book is that because you're talking to all of these different people, they all provide, when I say all, some of them provide some rather fascinating insights. So I think in chapter 5, I was kind of shocked to find out that Chichi is in fact a derogatory term for Anglo Indians. And
Mm,
especially growing up in a Punjabi household, like Chichi means all sorts of like random things. So
mm,
to hear that was quite interesting. And then also in chapter 7, you mentioned that some of the refugee camps set up in the wake of partition still exist, something which just boggles my mind,
mm.
considering obviously like how long it's been. But was there anything else that you came across during the interviews that you would kind of like, you almost
Mm.
had to like double take and read twice and be like, hold on, like,
Well, the refugee thing, I hadn't quite realised that there were still refugee camps with tens of thousands of people on them around the kind of the around the borders now with Bangladesh, which was then East Pakistan. I think every interview there was something that I found pretty gobsmacking in it, and it's that it's like that thing, the more you think you know, the less you actually know. And something as complex as partition, and you've got kind of the geographies and then different kind of the social strata, religions, you know, and then you've got people like who I have someone who's a Parsi who, you know, thought he was felt like he was kind of above the fray of it all because he wasn't, you know, Muslim, Sikh or Hindu. But I found it quite interesting that, like, to be British while there was kind of craziness, violence going on, was they weren't targeted. It wasn't, you know, only 6 people died during partition who were British. I was quite surprised at that, and that there wasn't perhaps more anger against them. And I found it quite interesting that, you know, there were orders for the British Indian Army not to intervene in the bloodshed. They could only protect British people, which I know a lot of British Indian officers found very, very difficult, because they could see what was happening. And so, yeah, there was so much that I learned.
Again, another reason why people should go read the book, because like you will obviously learn so much. I think one thing that the latest edition, sorry, of the book does, which is with the new chapter coda, it does a really great job of kind of showing that partition is as much Indian history as it is British history. And it was almost kind of synchronous. Yesterday, I happened to see a tweet, I can't remember who by, but it was essentially just a snippet of a Financial Times article. And it was a piece which was essentially stating that the UK has not critically considered its imperial past nor its present status. And again, I think they're obviously inextricably linked. But why do you think empire should be taught within Britain?
Because it's British history. You know, Britain went to, you know, it ruled India for 200 years. Partition is you know, marks the end of empire. It's when the British left. Migration happened from the former colonies to Britain because of empire. It's completely a British story. It explains why Britain looks the way it does today. It's why I'm here. It's why you're in Coventry. It is British history. And I don't understand how we you know, how we it's 2022 and children aren't taught that, because it's contemporary British history. And so I do believe it will be one day. I don't think it has to be a divisive thing. It's always talked about in a divisive way. I don't think it has to be. It's like the story of my dad and why he came here in 1959. We don't have to complicate things. But I do think it needs to be taught. And I do think people need to understand why Britain looks the way it does today.
Like, I completely agree. Like, as you could imagine, I think I've spoken with a number of other people who have echoed similar concerns, really. And I think even looking back at my own kind of school career, I think we only learned about British Empire once I got to university. Obviously, I had done kind of my own research and whatnot prior. And I think what's quite fascinating is that it's the collapse of the empire and kind of India becoming independent is also inextricably linked to the Second World War. And you learn so much about the Second World War. You're absolutely sick of it by the time you leave secondary school. And yet there's no mention of the empire, probably besides a sentence or two talking about how many colored folk died on the battlefields. The more that we are educated about it, and it is obviously British history because it was the British Empire, the better. And hopefully it informs then the next generation's understanding of who they are. So the last question I have for you, and this is more so of like kind of like a practical tips question, which is considering, let alone partition, but a lot of some of the experiences that say our parents and probably our grandparents went through are often quite traumatic. Like, what are some of the precautions and tips that you would say to those who want to go and talk to their relatives or whoever?
Well, I would say, firstly, do it, because you'll never regret it. Just do it on a phone. Put it, just chat in their favorite chair. Tell them you're doing it, and you're gonna put on voice memo. Don't start with the traumatic. Just say, start with, what was your favorite thing to do as a child? What was your favorite game? What did you love to eat? Who was your best friend? Talk about happy things. well, hopefully they're happy things. Um, just get to know them. Ask about their parents, ask about their grandparents, because that's kind of generations of your family. What did they do? What are their memories of them? Where do they live? I mean, often I would say yeah, I don't even, until I asked my dad like 3 months before he died, I didn't even know my grandmother's name. We don't know names. Ask names. Um, and so that's how I would say start. So it feels comfortable and it feels safe. Um, and don't just dive in with the like, okay, so what happened in partition, or like the most traumatic event. And then I'd leave it for a bit and then have another conversation and then say, can I ask you about whatever? It might not be partition, it might be some other traumatic event. Do you mind if I ask? But I think you've got to be very mindful. And what I've learned is that if it's getting too much, switch off the recording and say, let's have a cup of tea. But I'd also say something about pauses and silences, which is what that is that people are remembering. And you don't have to say anything, just sit there and let them be in that moment. And they might be, remembering something, remembering a conversation. They might be deciding, am I going to say what I remember, or am I not going to? And let them be in that particular moment. And I would also say we have to respect silences. And I don't mean the silence of telling that story. Don't push things. If people don't want to tell you, they have a right not to tell you. And actually, the stories you might want to hear is not the great, the big story of partition or migration or whatever it is. Actually, what might be the most interesting are the details of that person's life and their own kind of memories that are, quite unexpected.
No, definitely. No, thank you. I've got to the end of all of the questions that I had wanted to ask you. I just wanted to check before we wrap up. Is there anything that you wanted to include or wanted to mention?
No, I think you've done a great job. I think you've asked really interesting questions.
Thank you. That
Thank
really
you.
helps, because like the hardest problem, and I'm sure you can relate to this, hardest problem sometimes is figuring out what to ask and how to ask it, and are people going to find it interesting and all the rest of it. So no, I'm really glad that you're happy with that.
Well, I've loved talking to you.
No, thank you. All I can say is thank you so much for taking the time out. I've really enjoyed this. Otherwise than that, I will leave you to the rest of your day. I can just only echo and say thank you so much again for
likewise.
this. It's been brilliant. No, not a problem. Thank you so much.
All right, bye.
Take care. Bye. So you made it to the end of another podcast episode. I hope you've enjoyed this. If you have, or if you haven't, let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.